So my name is Julianne Nyhan, and I'm an Associate Professor of Digital Information Studies in UCL, and I'm going to tell you about one of my funded projects, which is Oceanic Exchanges, tracing global information networks in historical newspaper repositories 1840 to 1914. So how do you do digital humanities? Two of the most fundamental things are getting the funds that you need to do the research, and then also working collaboratively, because I think no individual can possess the full range of skills that are usually needed to do this kind of research. So for this project, we were lucky enough to get funding from the Transatlantic Partnership for Social Sciences and Humanities 2016 Digging into Data Challenge. It's a really useful funding scheme because it allows those who are successful to work, transatlantically and with other countries in the world. And here are some of the countries and the funding agencies which group together in order to support this particular program. And then the team of individuals involved in this project, so we are drawn from the US, Germany, Mexico, the Netherlands, Finland, and the UK. I've put the names of the PIs on the screen, and each of the PIs then works with sometimes a number of research associates or postdocs. And so the research that I'll present a bit of to you today is very much a collaborative team effort. We're also facilitated in our research by data providers, and so the research is about historic newspapers, about 19th century newspapers, and through our collaborations with these data providers, we have some 90 million pages of digitized newspapers at our disposal. I think the really nice thing about the providers is that they sort of run the gamut in terms of I guess the detail and the nature of what they're doing. So the Mexican digital newspaper library, they're at a reasonably early stage, so they've done a lot of digitization. The OCR work is ongoing. And then Australia's Trove project, I guess they're the most established, and they provide very sophisticated access to those some 18.5 million pages of newspapers that they provide. And then we also benefit from a strategic collaboration with Cengage Publishing, and they're the leading commercial custodians of digitized newspapers. So to say a little bit more about what the project is about, it is about flows of information through and with newspapers. So as we wrote in our funding bid, newspapers were the first big data for a mass audience. Their dramatic expansion over the course of the 19th century created a global culture of abundant, rapidly circulating information. So if you're a researcher and you want to shift your focus from considering newspapers in a national context to looking at Freudian slip computers, to looking at newspapers in a global context, despite the 90 million pages of newspapers that have been available and the types of actors that are working in this domain, it can still be quite difficult to ask questions at that global context for a number of reasons. And so by taking the flow of information in newspapers as our main object of study, we're searching for historical literary connections between newspapers around the world. And in doing so, we're seeking to push the conceptual, the technical, and the geographical boundaries of research into and with digital newspaper archives. And it's important to point out, I guess this is something that digital humanities research and any research must naturally be built on, which is involving many of the main actors in the domain within the new project. So this turn towards global research is one that's been taking place in a number of disciplines over the past years. And some existing digital newspaper projects have tried to develop tools that would allow researchers to work across collections. For example, the HERA project, Asymmetrical Encounters, looked especially at reference cultures. And we can also mention Europeana newspapers, the aggregator Europeana, which aggregates some 20 million images of newspapers in almost all of the continental languages. But as I said, what we're aiming to do is work across collections. So we want to understand how information flowed through newspapers, ultimately across the globe, as it were. And the really important thing is that we're not trying to take data out of those local institutional contexts. Actually, what we're trying to do is to build a layer that can go over those contexts so that the data stays in place, but that we can develop tools and methodologies and even understandings of how it is that you can sort of step back from this and ask more of these overarching questions. So the aims of the project is to model and visualize textual migration and viral culture via case studies, to create an ontology which will allow that researching across collections to take place, and to link digital repositories as a network via computational tools connected across remotely hosted data sets. So I think we're about halfway through the project now. So I'll just say a little bit more about some of the research that's currently ongoing. So if I go back to this first aim, that is to model and visualize textual migration and viral culture via case studies. So we're asking quite specific questions about that through the case studies that we've picked in order to test this approach on. And those research questions include questions like, which stories spread between nations and how quickly? Which texts were translated and resonated across languages? How did textual copying, that is reprinting, operate internationally compared to conceptual copying? And there is, so we have a number of ongoing case studies at the moment in UCL. We've started looking at attitudes towards female immigration from Great Britain to North America as these were reflected in newspapers, especially in discussions of the immigration societies that were set up at the time, and we're very interested in, for example, the construction of femininity through these newspaper articles. And other colleagues, such as Paul Fife and his team, they're looking at Kossuth and ideas of political celebrity, and also the colleagues in Germany are looking at the traffic of cholera in 19th century newspaper repositories. So there's a number of challenges, I guess, turning to talk in particular now about the kind of ontology work that we're doing. So thinking about these approaches that will allow researchers to work across collections. There's a number of challenges to doing this work. They include the imperfect comparability of what's been digitized, the different types of metadata formats that are used in for example, in libraries or by commercial providers, legal restrictions that might be attached to newspapers, and also the fact that I think this shift to doing research from a global perspective has not necessarily been adequately represented in the types of technologies that we have for making data machine readable. So to go back to say a little bit more about building this ontology. So there's a couple of steps involved. Understanding the metadata fields that were used by the different hosts, building the ontology, sharing the results, and also actually conducting interviews with institutions in order to retrace and to understand the choices that they made in the digitization processes. And if you look, Melody Beals, she's written a number of really interesting blog posts on our website where she's setting out for those different digital newspaper collections we've been looking at what the histories of the collection are and what we found out about the types of decisions that were made around them, for example, the metadata standards and so on. The early results of the interviews with private and public providers of digital newspapers is that so as such, users of digital archives are often invited to make use of seemingly discrete and complete archives. But at the same time they can, I'm making some generalizations, but it can often be the case that the researchers then receive limited information about why the material they hold was chosen and curated, how it was obtained, and from which source material it was transformed into a digital copy. So, if a newspaper has been digitized from the microfilm that was created of it at an earlier stage, of course that's important to understand, because the decisions that would have been made in relation to the microfilm, for example, which of the particular issues of that newspaper on a given day was digitized, the decisions that were made at that stage then feed into, they resonate and echo in the digital presentation of those digital newspapers. So, and Paul Fife and other people have referred to the way that this information doesn't tend to be made available as what we might think of the missing historical middle, or this invisibility of these sort of deep managerial and administrative histories of these digital collections. So the interview questionnaires that we've developed have sought to elicit information about the kinds of decisions that influence which newspapers are selected for digitization, understandings of the end user, and how those understandings of the end user then influence the types of access that providers provide to those newspapers, technical decisions about metadata, along with reflections on the so-called unintended consequences. So just to I would say that the thing that's really struck me out of these interviews is that you may think that when you make this shift to doing this analysis at scale, so when you're asking these intensely data-driven questions from global perspectives, that somehow dissolves the local. That somehow dissolves the local and the contextual, but it doesn't, and in some ways it makes it even more important. And by understanding those decisions that were taken about collections, it allows us not only to contextualize results more carefully, but also to better approach comparability of results across collections. So to sum up, our work is not about building a totalizing research infrastructure or one all-encompassing archive. And I think digital humanities has really sort of moved away from the monolithic, or aspirations towards the monolithic. We are very interested in exploring the conditions through which researchers can work across collections and to contributing to the uncovering and making visible of those choices that were taken around digitization. It's not entirely clear to me why it is that those decisions are not necessarily recorded. And I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on why that might be the case. And then also working with libraries, and I think also it's fair to say publishers to improve interoperability. So there for publishers there might not be perhaps be maybe the monetary case to work with us, but we found that we've benefited very much from sort of strategic and from intellectual alliances where we can contribute findings and recommendations to one another. So, and that is my time up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Julianne.